Some women walk into a courtroom knowing they may never walk out. They get sentenced to decades, sometimes life, sometimes worse. But years pass, evidence shifts, laws change. These are the women who sat behind bars for some of the longest stretches in American history, outlived the sentences that were meant to bury them. Kimberly Long.
Are you gonna tell me good news?
And we're telling you great news.
Back in October 2003, Kimberly Long came home after a night out with friends in Corona, California, and found her boyfriend, Oswaldo Conde, slumped over on the couch with a massive head wound. Blood was on every wall of the living room. She called 911, frantic, believing he might still be breathing. But paramedics arrived and determined Conde had been dead for quite some time. His skin ashen, his body cold, early signs of decomposition already setting in. Police zeroed in on Long almost immediately. She and Conde had argued earlier that evening. She left to go out with friends, and a friend named Jeff Dills told investigators he had dropped her off at 1:20 a.m., which was about 49 minutes before she dialed 911. Long insisted Dills was mistaken about the time, but that gap became the foundation of the prosecution's entire case, arguing she beat Conde, changed her bloody clothes, and disposed of the weapon in that window. Her first trial ended in a mistrial, with 9 of 12 jurors voting not guilty, so the evidence was shaky even then. But at a second trial in December 2005, the jury convicted her of second-degree murder. The sentencing judge actually said on the record that if he had heard the evidence himself, he would have found her not guilty. She was sentenced to 15 years to life. In 2010, the California Innocence Project took up her case. They brought in new expert testimony on the time of death, showing Conde was likely killed while Long was out with friends. A judge overturned her conviction in 2016, and she was released after 7 years behind bars. An appellate court tried to reinstate the conviction, but on the 30th of November 2020, the California Supreme Court unanimously sided with the reversal. On the 22nd of April 2021, the Riverside County District Attorney formally dismissed all charges. Kirstin Blaise Lobato.
16 years after being wrongfully convicted of murder.
At just 18 years old, Kirstin Blaise Lobato was arrested for the brutal 2001 murder and mutilation of Duran Bailey, a homeless man in Las Vegas. His body was found behind a dumpster in the parking lot of a bank building on the evening of the 8th of July 2001. He had been beaten, his skull cracked, teeth knocked out, neck slashed, and his genitals removed. So how did an 18-year-old girl from a small town 3 hours north of Las Vegas end up charged with this? About 2 months before Bailey was killed, Lobato was visiting friends in Las Vegas when a man tried to assault her in a motel parking lot. She defended herself with a small knife, cutting at the man's groin area, and told people about it in the weeks that followed. Eventually, a probation officer in her hometown of Panaca called Las Vegas police about it. Detectives Thomas Thuzen and James LaRochelle took that story and twisted it into something else entirely. They brought Lobato in for questioning without an attorney and later claimed she had confessed to killing a man. Lobato has always maintained she was talking about the attempted assault, not a murder. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no physical evidence, and no witnesses linking her to the scene. But in 2002, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 40 to 100 years. The Nevada Supreme Court threw that out in 2004 because her lawyers could not cross-examine a key prosecution witness. A retrial in 2006 ended with a conviction on voluntary manslaughter and a sentence of 13 to 45 years. But new evidence proved Lobato was with her family in Panaca, nearly 170 miles away, when Bailey was killed. In December 2017, a Clark County judge dismissed all charges, and she was released in January 2018 after spending nearly 16 years behind bars. In 2024, a federal jury awarded her $34 million in damages, finding that Las Vegas police fabricated evidence against her. Betty Smithey.
An exclusive twist tonight on a story once again putting our state in the national spotlight.
When Betty Smithey walked out of Perryville State Prison in Arizona in August 2012, she had spent 49 years behind bars. She was the longest-serving female inmate in the entire country. Smithey was 20 years old when she was convicted of the 1,963 New Year's Day murder of 15-month-old Sandy Gerberick, a child she had been hired to babysit less than a week earlier in Northwest Phoenix. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Under Arizona law at the time, only the governor could grant her clemency. Those early years inside were rough. Smithey escaped 4 times from 3 different prisons and was, by all accounts, angry and not adjusting to incarceration. But in 1983, something changed. She received a letter from Sandy Gerberick's mother, forgiving her for what she had done. Smythe later said that if Sandy's mother could find it in herself to forgive, then she had a responsibility to become a better person. And by all accounts, she did. She was recommended for clemency in 1994 and again in 2003, but both sitting governors turned her down. It was not until Governor Jan Brewer agreed to commute her sentence to 48 years to life that she got a real shot at freedom. At 69 years old, walking with a cane and having battled breast cancer, Smith went before Arizona's Board of Executive Clemency. The board chairman told her he saw no value in keeping her locked up any longer and voted to grant her release. After stepping outside for the first time in nearly 5 decades, she called it wonderful to drive down the road and not see any barbed wire. Debra Milke.
Prison over at Maricopa County Jail last week. Now, she was convicted in 1989 of killing her 4-year-old son.
In December 1989, 4-year-old Christopher Milke was told he was going to see Santa Claus at the mall. Instead, he was driven to a desert wash north of Phoenix by James Lynn Stiers and Roger Mark Scott, where Stiers shot the boy 3 times in the back of the head. Debra Milke, Christopher's mother, was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecution alleged she had orchestrated the whole thing for a $5,000 life insurance policy that came with a new job. The case rested almost entirely on Phoenix homicide detective Armando Saldate. He claimed Milke confessed to him during an unrecorded, unwitnessed interrogation with no notes taken. 3 days later, Saldate wrote up a report saying she admitted to arranging her son's death. Milke denied ever confessing. Stiers and Scott were tried separately and convicted. Neither testified against Milke at her trial, and Stiers actually said she had no involvement whatsoever. But the jury believed the detective. In 1990, Milke was convicted and sentenced to death, becoming one of only 4 women on Arizona's death row. For over 2 decades, Milke fought her conviction from inside a cell. In 2013, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned it, revealing that Detective Saldate had a long history of misconduct, including lying under oath in multiple cases. He had also been suspended for accepting sexual favors on the job. Prosecutors knew about this record and never disclosed it to the defense. In March 2015, Judge Rosa Gimenez dismissed all charges with prejudice. That made Milke only the 2nd woman in U.S. history to be exonerated from death row after spending over 22 years locked up. Cyntoia Brown.
My hair and drugging and stuff. He put guns up me, told me to strip and stuff like that, getting that in with other people.
On the night of the 6th of August 2004, 43-year-old real estate agent Johnny Allen picked up a 16-year-old girl near a Sonic drive-in in Nashville, Tennessee. That girl was Cyntoia Brown. Brown was not there by choice in any meaningful sense. She had been living with a man she called Cutthroat, who beat her, controlled her, and forced her into prostitution. That night, he ordered her to go out and make money. Allen brought her to his home and showed her guns, telling her he had been a sharpshooter in the army. After they ate and went to bed, Brown says he reached toward the side of the bed where his weapons were. Fearing for her life, she grabbed a .40 caliber handgun from his nightstand and shot him in the back of the head. She took money from his wallet and his truck and left. Prosecutors painted a different picture, saying Brown planned a robbery from the start and that this was a cold-blooded execution. Despite being just 16, Brown was tried as an adult. In 2006, she was convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery and sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 51 years. Her case gained national attention after a PBS documentary aired in 2011, and celebrities, including Kim Kardashian and Rihanna, shared her story. Advocates argued she was a child victim of sex trafficking who could not legally consent to any of what happened. On the 7th of January, 2019, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam granted her clemency, calling it a tragic and complex case. She was released on the 7th of August, 2019, after 15 years behind bars. Sandra Hemme.
This is the smile of a free woman.
She's been gone 43 years.
Sandra Hemme was 20 years old and a patient in a psychiatric hospital in St. Time. Joseph, Missouri. When detectives came to question her about the November 1980 stabbing death of library worker Patricia Jeschke, what followed were weeks of interrogations during which Hemme, who was heavily medicated, gave wildly contradictory and factually impossible statements. At one point she said she witnessed a man commit the murder, but that man was in another city at the time. At other points, she claimed, extrasensory perception told her about the crime. Eventually, she said she thought she stabbed Jeschke with a hunting knife but was not sure. There was no forensic evidence linking Hemme to the scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, no motive. But there was someone else. During a search of Officer Michael Holman's home, investigators found items belonging to the victim, including earrings and a credit card Holman had attempted to use. The police chief at the time actually removed an investigator from the case after he concluded Holman, not Hemme, was the killer. Holman died in 2015. Hemme pleaded guilty in 1981 and received life without parole. She later withdrew that plea, was retried in 1985, convicted again, and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for at least 50 years. She contacted the Innocence Project around 2006, and they took her case in 2018. On the 14th of June 2024, Judge Ryan Horsman overturned her conviction, writing that no evidence outside of her unreliable statements connected her to the crime. The Missouri Attorney General fought to keep her behind bars even after a judge declared her innocent. But on the 19th of July 2024, she was released after spending 43 years in prison, making her the longest-known wrongfully incarcerated woman in U.S. history. Sarah Kruzen.
To take his life like that.
Sarah Kruzen grew up in Riverside, California, with a drug-addicted mother who eventually kicked her out at age 11. Her father was in and out of prison. At that age, she met George Gilbert Howard, who went by GG. He seemed kind at first, took an interest in her, bought her things, but by the time she was 13, Howard had begun sexually abusing her and trafficking her as a child prostitute. On the 10th of March 1994, at age 16, Kruzen shot Howard in the neck at a Dynasty Suites motel in Riverside. She took $1,500 from his wallet and the keys to his Jaguar. In 1995, at 17, she was tried as an adult, convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. For years, her case drew attention from advocates who argued that a child trafficking victim should not spend the rest of her life in prison for killing the man who exploited her. In a 2009 video recorded by Human Rights Watch, Kruzen said she knew she deserved punishment, but acknowledged that taking a life was never acceptable. Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger commuted her sentence to 25 years to life on his last day in office in January 2011, calling the original sentence excessive. In 2013, a Riverside County judge reduced her conviction to second-degree murder, and she was released after serving 18 years. In July 2022, Governor Gavin Newsom officially pardoned her, recognizing her transformation and dedication to community service and anti-trafficking advocacy. Marie LaPinta.
In intolerable and inescapable circumstances.
On the 27th of March, 1983, Michael LaPinta was shot and killed in his home in West Islip, New York. His wife, Marie LaPinta, and her brother, Leonardo Crociata, were both charged with his murder. Crociata fired the fatal shots, but Marie was charged alongside him and the two were tried together. Here is where the problems start. Both defendants were represented by attorneys from the same law firm. So while Marie's defense should have centered on the years of physical and psychological abuse she suffered at her husband's hands, her lawyer could not go in that direction without potentially conflicting with his colleague's defense of her brother. There were 11 restraining orders against Michael LaPinta for domestic abuse, but none of that made it into the courtroom the way it should have. In 1984, both Marie and her brother were convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. For more than 2 decades, Marie's sons fought to free their mother. One of them, Anthony, became a lawyer specifically to work on her case, while the other, Lenny, ran a website called mercyformom.org and lobbied the governor for a pardon. In 2005, Anthony persuaded a judge to overturn her conviction on the grounds that she received ineffective counsel due to the conflict of interest. Prosecutors agreed that had battered woman syndrome laws existed at the time, Marie would have been eligible for that defense. She was released in May 2005 at the age of 69, having served over 20 years. Debbie Sims, Africa. On the 8th of August, 1978, Philadelphia police laid siege to the Powelton Village compound of MOVE, a radical black liberation and back-to-nature organization founded in the early 1970s. During the confrontation, Officer James Ramp was shot and killed. 9 MOVE members were arrested, including Debbie Sims, Africa, who was 22 at the time. All 9 were convicted of third-degree murder, and each was sentenced to 30 to 100 years in prison. No evidence was presented that any of the women had handled firearms or had any direct role in the shooting. MOVE members have long maintained that Officer Ramp was killed by friendly fire from another officer. 2 of the MOVE 9 died in prison. Merle Austin, Africa, passed away in 1998, and Phil, Africa, in 2015. The remaining members became eligible for parole in 2008, but the board denied them repeatedly. Debbie went before the parole board 8 times. In May 2018, she, along with Janine and Janet, Africa, appeared before the board, but only Debbie was granted parole. On the 16th of June 2018, she walked out of the State Correctional Institution at Cambridge Springs after nearly 40 years behind bars. She was the first of the MOVE 9 to be freed. Her son, Michael Davis Jr., whom she had given birth to in her prison cell in September 1978, was 39 years old when she was released. Janine and Janet, Africa, were eventually paroled the following year. Kathy Woods.
Woods was convicted 2 different times and sentenced to life in prison without parole.
In February 1976, 19-year-old University of Nevada, Reno student Michelle Mitchell was stabbed to death near campus. The case went unsolved for 3 years. Then, in 1979, Kathy Woods, who had moved to Louisiana and was a patient in a psychiatric hospital, mentioned the murder to a staff member. Detectives traveled to Louisiana and interrogated her without a lawyer. Woods was psychotic at the time, and her statements to police were unreliable, but they used them to build a case against her. In 1980, she was convicted of Mitchell's murder. The Nevada Supreme Court overturned that conviction, but she was convicted again in a second trial in 1984. For 35 years, Woods sat in prison. Then, in 2013, DNA testing was conducted on a cigarette butt found near Mitchell's body. The DNA did not belong to Woods. It belonged to Rodney Halbauer, an Oregon prison inmate linked to several murders of young women in Northern California during the same period. Halbauer was later convicted of 2 San Francisco Bay Area killings from 1976. In September 2014, a judge vacated Woods' conviction. She was released in 2015, having served 35 years for a crime she had nothing to do with. At the time, the National Registry of Exonerations listed her as the longest ever wrongfully incarcerated woman in U.S. history. In 2019, the Washoe County Commission agreed to a $3 million settlement in her federal civil rights lawsuit. Nicole Boon.
Larry, I spoke with Officer Robert Rueka of the San Francisco Police Department.
On the 30th of September, 1999, Nicole Boon got into an argument with her boyfriend, Ronnie Moss II, inside their Cobb County, Georgia townhome. They shared a 9-month-old son together. Boynton had already endured a childhood marked by trauma and sexual abuse before Moss entered her life and became physically violent with her. During the altercation, Boynton stabbed Moss and he died from the wound. Under Georgia law at the time, there was no room for nuance. She was convicted of felony murder and aggravated assault, and the charge carried an automatic life sentence with no other option for the judge. She later learned there had been a plea offer for 15 years on the table, but she says that information never reached her when it mattered. For 23 years, Boynton sat behind bars. She earned multiple certifications while incarcerated, stayed out of trouble, and tried to build something despite the circumstances. Her case became an example of how the legal system often fails to account for the reality of abuse, especially for Black women. Then, in 2025, Georgia passed the Survivor Justice Act, which allows judges to consider whether domestic abuse was a significant factor in the crime during sentencing and post-conviction proceedings. On the 5th of January 2026, a judge vacated Boynton's life sentence and resentenced her to time served, making her the first person in Georgia history to be released under the new law. She was 44 years old and said that stepping outside did not feel real at first. Leslie Van Houten.
of Charles Manson and is now...
Leslie Van Houten was 19 years old in August 1969 when she participated in one of the most notorious crimes in American history. Under the direction of cult leader Charles Manson, Van Houten and other members of the so-called Manson family broke into the Los Angeles home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. Van Houten held Rosemary LaBianca down with a pillowcase over her head while others stabbed her. Then, on Manson follower Charles Watson's orders, Van Houten picked up a knife and stabbed Rosemary more than a dozen times herself. In 1971, she was sentenced to death. The following year, California's Supreme Court overturned the state's death penalty, and her sentence was commuted to life with the possibility of parole. Van Houten was recommended for parole 5 times beginning in 2016. Every single time, the sitting governor blocked it. Both Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom rejected the recommendations. But in May 2023, a California appeals court ruled that Van Houten was entitled to parole. Newsom announced he would not fight the ruling. On the 11th of July 2023, Van Houten walked out of the California Institution for Women in Corona at the age of 73. She had spent 53 years behind bars. She was the first member of the Manson family involved in the murders to be paroled. Her attorney said she was still trying to get used to the idea that it was real. After spending most of her life inside, she was taken to transitional housing where she received training on basic life skills like how to use a cell phone and grocery shop. Joyce Watkins.
Reaction from her family, Randy.
In the summer of 1987, Joyce Watkins and her boyfriend, Charlie Dunn, drove to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to pick up Watkins' 4-year-old great-niece, Brandy. The child had been staying with another aunt, Rose Williams, for 2 months. They brought Brandy back to Nashville, and 9 hours later, the child was found unresponsive. Watkins noticed blood in the girl's underwear and rushed her to Nashville Memorial Hospital. Doctors found signs of severe head trauma and sexual injury. Brandy died the following day. Investigators charged Watkins and Dunn with first-degree murder and aggravated rape. In 1988, a jury convicted them both, and the medical evidence presented at trial was central to the conviction. They spent 27 years in prison. Dunn died behind bars in 2015, shortly before his scheduled parole hearing. Watkins was granted parole that same year, but was forced to register as a sex offender. She walked into the Tennessee Innocence Project's office and told them her story. The Nashville District Attorney's Conviction Review Unit reopened the case. They found that a significant portion of the medical testimony used at trial had since been debunked by modern science. The trial prosecutor also falsely told the jury that Watkins had washed bedsheets to destroy evidence. On the 12th of January, 2022, a Nashville judge vacated both convictions. Dunn was posthumously exonerated as well. Watkins was 74 years old and became the first black woman in Tennessee history to have her conviction overturned. She said it had been a long struggle, but she had never been the type to give up. Mary Virginia Jones.
A 74-year-old woman who spent the last 32 years behind bars has finally heard the words that she's been waiting for.
Before 1981, Mary Virginia Jones was a church-going woman who worked as a teacher's aide in Los Angeles and had never been arrested. Then she met Mose Willis, a homeless man she took in because he said he wanted to turn his life around. Willis became violent and abusive. On the night of the crime, he kidnapped 2 men at gunpoint and forced Jones to drive a car to a back alley in Los Angeles, where Willis shot both men, killing one. Jones fled the scene, fully expecting Willis to shoot her too, but the prosecution charged her right alongside Willis. It took 4 trials to convict her. The first resulted in a reversal on appeal because the court failed to properly instruct the jury, and the second and third ended in hung juries. The fourth, in 1987, ended in a first-degree murder conviction. Jones was sentenced to life, without the possibility of parole. Willis was sentenced to death and later died of natural causes on death row. For 3 decades, Jones maintained that she had been forced to participate at gunpoint. Law students at USC's Post-Conviction Justice Project took up her case. They argued that previous juries never heard expert testimony on the effects of intimate partner battering, which was not an established legal concept at the time of her conviction. In March 2014, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office agreed to accept a no-contest plea to voluntary manslaughter with a time-served sentence. A judge ruled she had served well over the 1-year maximum for the lesser crime. At 74 years old, after 32 years behind bars, Jones walked free. Kirstin Bunch. On the 30th of June 1995, a fire broke out in a trailer home in Decatur County, Indiana. 3-year-old Anthony Bunch died in the blaze. His mother, Kirstin Bunch, was outside the trailer when the fire started and was unable to get back in to reach him. State arson investigator Brian Frank concluded the fire was intentionally set using a liquid accelerant like kerosene. 6 days later, Kirstin was charged with arson and felony murder. There was no clear motive. She was an unemployed single mother on food stamps with no life insurance policy. At trial in 1996, Frank told the jury about accelerant readings and burn patterns. Kirstin, who was pregnant at the time, was convicted and sentenced to 60 years for murder and 50 years for arson to run concurrently. But the science Frank relied on was already becoming outdated. In 2004, Texas executed Cameron Todd Willingham based on similar arson evidence that was later discredited, sparking a national conversation about flawed fire investigation methods. The National Fire Protection Association's Guide, NFPA 921, established new standards, and the old methods Frank used were proven unreliable. The Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University took up Bunch's case. 3 fire forensic experts reviewed the evidence and concluded the fire was accidental. Additionally, key documents had been withheld from the defense before trial. In March 2012, the Indiana Court of Appeals reversed her conviction. Prosecutors declined to retry her, and after more than 17 years in prison, but the science Frank relied on was already becoming outdated. In 2004, Texas executed Cameron Todd Willingham based on similar arson evidence that was later discredited, sparking a national conversation about flawed fire investigation methods. The National Fire Protection Association's Guide, NFPA 921, established new standards, and the old methods Frank used were proven unreliable. The Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University took up Bunch's case. 3 fire forensic experts reviewed the evidence and concluded the fire was accidental. Additionally, key documents had been withheld from the defense before trial. In March 2012, the Indiana Court of Appeals reversed her conviction. Prosecutors declined to retry her, and after more than 17 years in prison, Brenda Clubine.
UCA helps thousands of people every year, and a lot of those are victims of domestic violence. Tonight in her special report, Battered Not Broken, Tara Brantley talks with an abused ex-con.
For years, Brenda Clubine endured broken bones, skull fractures, and nights in hospitals at the hands of her husband, a former police detective. There were 11 restraining orders against him and a warrant out for his arrest. But because he was a respected figure in the community, nobody believed he was capable of what he was doing behind closed doors. In 1983, Clubine met her husband at a motel to sign divorce papers. He attacked her again and told her to hand over her wedding rings. When she asked why, he told her it was because tomorrow they would not be able to identify her body without them. Clubine grabbed a wine bottle and struck him in the head. He died from blunt force trauma. She was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 16 years to life. Because battered women's syndrome was not yet a legally recognized defense in California, the judge would not allow a psychologist to testify about her mental state. Friends and doctors who had witnessed evidence of her abuse were also barred from testifying. While inside, Clubine started a support group called Convicted Women Against Abuse, the first inmate-led domestic violence support group in the U.S. prison system. Her group's work caught the attention of filmmaker Olivia Klaus, whose documentary Sin by Silence helped push California lawmakers to pass new legislation allowing domestic violence evidence to be reconsidered in older cases. In 2008, after 26 years in prison, Clubine's sentence was reduced to involuntary manslaughter, and she was released with credit for time served. Stacia Aguayo.
A valued member of Washington society in the future.
And you're asking for forgiveness.
This is my dad. I think he was in 8th grade. And now you know where I get it from. Red hair, blue eyes, and freckles.
I'm Dan Ague, AGUE.
This is my dad holding me when I was a baby. There's probably like maybe 10 pictures altogether I have from when I was a kid. This is the only picture I have of my mom and dad when I was that young.
I'm Stacia Ague's dad. That's my baby girl. I love her with all my heart. If I had to chop my arm off for her, I would.
I'm Lieutenant Stevens with Tomata Police. Have to advise you're being audio and video.
Growing up in Olympia, Washington, Stacia Aguayo moved in and out of homeless shelters with her mother, who regularly beat her. Her father ran a meth lab, and her mother kicked her out at 11. By the age of 15, in 2003, Aguayo was charged with 6 Class A felonies during a robbery, including kidnapping. She received what Washington state calls juvie life, meaning mandatory incarceration until age 21. She served 6 years, but those years were not wasted. Even inside, Aguayo pushed back against a system that tried to apply a one-size-fits-all approach. After being transferred to a foster-type arrangement in Spokane Valley for her final year, she attended community college and worked at a hardware store. Upon release, she enrolled at Washington State University and earned a bachelor's degree in criminal justice in 2010. She then stood before the Washington State Legislature and shared her story to push for Senate Bill 6561, which allows juvenile Class A felony records to be sealed after 5 years of a clean record. She became a Youth and Family Advocate Program Administrator with Washington State's juvenile justice system, working to reform the very system that once held her. Her story is proof that a sentence does not have to be the final word on who someone is. Rosa Gimenez.
I was raw of everything. Every single dream was a strip for me.
In January 2003, Rosa Gimenez was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico living in Austin, Texas. She was 7 months pregnant and caring for her 1-year-old daughter along with a 1-month-old boy she babysat for extra money. While Gimenez was preparing lunch, the toddler began choking. She could not dislodge whatever was stuck and rushed to a neighbor for help before calling 911. Paramedics pulled a wad of 5 paper towels from the child's throat. The boy suffered brain damage from oxygen deprivation and died 3 months later. 3 medical experts at her 2005 trial testified that it would have been impossible for a child that young to swallow paper towels on his own, so the prosecution argued Gimenez must have forced them into his mouth. Her court-appointed attorney presented no credible expert witnesses to challenge this claim. Gimenez spoke almost no English and was interrogated for over 5 hours by an officer who barely spoke Spanish. She was convicted and sentenced to 99 years for injury to a child and 75 years for murder. While incarcerated, she gave birth to her 2nd child in shackles. The baby was taken from her immediately. The Innocence Project took her case in 2009 and found experts who testified that young children do, in fact, swallow large objects. The original medical testimony was not grounded in science. In 2021, a Travis County judge found that there was no crime committed and that Gimenez was innocent. She was released on bond. On the 7th of August, 2023, all charges were formally dismissed. She had spent 18 years behind bars for a tragic accident that was never a crime. Susan Melon.
Show me and let you answer. Okay, they're going to need, the cameras are going to need the angle there for me. So come on over here, guys. Let's run around the back.
In 1997, Susan Melon was convicted of orchestrating the beating death of Richard Daley, a homeless man, at a home in Lawndale, California, where both she and Daley had been living. The conviction was based entirely on the testimony of one woman, June Patty, who claimed she heard Melon confess to planning the murder. There was no physical evidence and no other witnesses connecting Melon to the crime. What the jury did not know was that Patty had a long and documented history of giving false tips to law enforcement. She was, as the judge who later reviewed the case put it, a habitual liar. Patty died in 2006. Melon was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Deirdre O'Connor, head of a project called Innocence Matters, investigated the case and found that 3 known gang members were actually responsible for Daley's death. One of them was eventually convicted of the killing. Another took a polygraph test and confirmed that Melon had nothing to do with it. On the 10th of October 2014, Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Mark Arnold overturned Melon's conviction, saying he believed she was innocent and that the justice system failed her. She was 59 years old and had spent 17 years behind bars. A month later, she was officially declared factually innocent, clearing the way for state compensation. Joyce Brown.
The last time we did a story in Dallas about someone who may have been wrongly convicted of a crime, his name was Lynell Jeter. When we caught up with him, he was in jail for life.
On the 6th of May 1980, two women robbed a fur store called Fine Furs by Reuben in Dallas, Texas. The owner, Reuben Danziger, was shot and killed, and his wife, Alla, survived after she told the robbers she was dying of cancer. Police traced the getaway car, a rented brown 1980 Datsun, back to a woman named Joyce Ann Brown, but it was the wrong Joyce Ann Brown. The woman who actually rented the car shared the same name, and that coincidence set off a chain of events that would cost the innocent Joyce Ann Brown nearly a decade of her life. At trial, the victim's wife identified Brown as one of the robbers. A jailhouse informant named Martha Jean Bruce also testified that Brown had confessed while they shared a cell. What the prosecution did not disclose was that Bruce had been convicted of lying to police just months earlier. Brown presented an alibi, showing she was at work during the robbery, with only a 3-6-minute lunch break. The prosecution argued that 36 minutes was enough to leave, change clothes, commit the crime, and return. On the 23rd of October 1980, she was convicted and sentenced to life. The actual perpetrator, Renee Michelle Taylor, was arrested 6 months later and eventually pleaded guilty to the murder. Taylor refused to identify her accomplice, but confirmed that neither woman named Joyce Ann Brown was involved. With help from Centurion Ministries and a CBS 60 Minutes broadcast in 1989 that brought national attention to the case, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reversed Brown's conviction, finding prosecutorial misconduct. She was freed on the 3rd of November, 1989, after 9 years, 5 months, and 24 days behind bars. She went on to found an organization called MASS to help wrongfully convicted prisoners and newly released inmates transition back into society. Brown passed away in June 2015 at the age of 68.